The morning sun was perfect, but the bird on our breakfast table was not. Its tiny legs were tied with red silk, and its eyes had been cut away. My wife, Evelyn, just smiled at me through her porcelain mask, hiding a rot that was suffocating our home. I thought I was a detective who knew every dirty secret in this city, but I never realized the most dangerous monster was the one pouring my coffee. What happens when the perfect American dream turns into a bloody nightmare? You are about to find out why the only person I could trust was the one woman the world forbade me to love. The Connecticut sun was far too generous that morning, flooding our dining room with a thick, honeyed light that felt like a deceptive promise of a long and happy life. It poured through the pristine panes of the sash windows, illuminating the swirling dust motes that danced in the stagnant air above the heavy mahogany table. The heat was already beginning to settle into the floorboards, a heavy, invisible weight that made the starch in my collar feel like a serrated blade against my neck. Everything was bathed in a golden hue that should have been warm, yet it felt strangely clinical, like a stage light illuminating a play that had run for far too many seasons without a single change in the script. Evelyn sat across from me, looking as though she had been carved from fine porcelain and dressed by a committee of silent, judgmental seamstresses. Her floral cotton dress was a masterpiece of mid-century restraint, the tiny blue hydrangeas perfectly aligned with every fold of the fabric as she leaned forward in her chair. Her blonde hair was caught in a frozen wave, a rigid sculpture of vanity that allowed for not a single stray strand to disrupt the oppressive symmetry of her face. She was the very image of the American dream, a polished figurine designed to be looked at but never truly touched, lest the fragile glaze of her composure should crack under the slightest pressure. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic, abrasive scrape of her silver knife against the charred surface of a piece of sourdough toast. It was a dry, skeletal noise that seemed to vibrate in the back of my skull, punctuating the chirping of the robins outside with a violent regularity. Between each scrape, a heavy silence descended, thick enough to taste, flavored with the metallic tang of the silver and the cloying sweetness of the orange marmalade. I watched her hand move with mechanical precision, her fingers pale and bloodless as they gripped the handle, performing the domestic ritual with a devotion that bordered on the religious. I shifted in my chair, the leather sticking to the back of my shirt, and found myself staring at the thin strand of pearls encircling her throat. They were white and lustrous, catching the morning light with a predatory gleam, but to me, they looked more like a delicate garrote than a piece of jewelry. Every time she swallowed, the pearls shifted slightly, a reminder of the suffocating grip of the life we had constructed in this quiet suburb of white picket fences and manicured lawns. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to reach across the table and snap the string, just to see if she would finally take a breath that wasn't dictated by the social expectations of her station. The smell of the room was a suffocating blend of lemon-scented furniture wax and the sharp, acidic aroma of black coffee that had been sitting on the stove for far too long. Beneath those dominant notes was the faint, powdery scent of Evelyn's expensive French perfume, a floral bouquet that reminded me of a funeral parlor trying to hide the smell of decay. It was a house that smelled of cleanliness and order, a place where dirt was a sin and secrets were swept under the heavy Persian rugs until they formed invisible mounds we had to step over every day. I took a sip of my coffee, let the bitterness scald my tongue, and waited for someone to speak. Evelyn finally looked up from her plate, offering me a smile that was practiced and hollow, a mere stretching of the lips that never reached the icy depths of her pale blue eyes. It was the smile she wore to the garden club meetings and the charity galas, a mask of serene contentment that she donned every morning along with her foundation and her earrings. "You're going to be late for the office, Arthur," she murmured, her voice as smooth and characterless as the marble countertop in the kitchen. She reached out to push the crystal cream pitcher toward me, her movements graceful and fluid, yet entirely devoid of any warmth or genuine connection. When I reached out to take the handle of the pitcher, my fingers brushed against hers for a fleeting second, and I was struck by how cold her skin felt despite the sweltering heat. It was the temperature of a stone pulled from a shaded creek, a chilling sensation that seemed to travel up my arm and settle in my chest like a block of ice. She didn't flinch or acknowledge the contact, her gaze drifting back to the window where the golden light continued to mock us with its vibrancy. I felt like a ghost haunting my own breakfast table, a man who had become a mere accessory in the grand, terrifyingly beautiful production of her perfect life. I lowered my gaze back to the table, trying to focus on the geometric patterns of the white lace cloth that Evelyn had inherited from her mother's estate in Newport. The sunlight caught something near her elbow, a small disturbance in the sea of white and silver that I had not noticed when I first sat down to eat. At first, I thought it was a fallen leaf or perhaps a piece of debris she had neglected to clear, though that was impossible given her obsession with order. I leaned in slightly, my heart beginning a slow, uneven thud against my ribs as the shape began to resolve into something recognizable and deeply wrong. Lying there, right beside her butter knife, was the tiny and mangled body of the yellow canary we had purchased only 6 days ago to brighten the sunroom. The bird was not merely dead, its fragile chest had been crushed, and its delicate, twig-like legs were tied together with a meticulous knot of bright red silk thread. Its feathers were matted with a dark, dried substance that looked like rusted iron, and its head was tilted at an impossible, sickening angle that exposed the vertebrae. The most harrowing detail was the eyes, which had been picked or cut clean away, leaving 2 dark, empty pits that stared up at me with a silent, echoing scream. Evelyn continued to chew her toast with the same rhythmic, unhurried precision, her expression remaining as tranquil as a deep-sea fish lurking in the shadows of an abyss. She did not look down at the small, feathered corpse, nor did she acknowledge the way my hand began to tremble as I set the coffee cup back into its saucer with a sharp clink. The honeyed light of the Connecticut morning felt suddenly frigid, a golden shroud draped over a room that had become a tomb for something more than just a songbird. I stared at her, waiting for a flicker of recognition or a spark of horror, but she only blinked slowly, her gaze fixed on the empty air between us. The drive into the city felt like stripping off a layer of toxic radiation. The pristine lawns of the suburbs gave way to the honest decay of industrial brickwork and the jagged skeletons of fire escapes. I watched the world transform from a curated museum of white-painted lies into a visceral, breathing organism that did not care about my moral failings. The steering wheel was slick beneath my palms, and the ghost of that tied-up canary remained perched on the dashboard of my mind. It was a relief to see the soot-stained facade of my building rising up to meet the gray sky like an old, battered friend who knew all my worst secrets and kept them anyway. I climbed the 5 flights of stairs, the wooden banister creaking under the weight of my exhaustion as the heat of the morning began to pool in the narrow stairwell. Each step was a deliberate distance placed between myself and the porcelain horror of that breakfast table in Connecticut. The air grew thinner and more pungent with the smells of other people's desperate lives, stale cabbage, cheap perfume, and the metallic tang of old radiator pipes. By the time I reached the top floor, my lungs were burning, but it was a grounding, physical pain that forced me back into my own body. I paused for a moment, adjusting my hat, and let the silence of the hallway settle around me like a heavy, protective blanket. The door to my office bore my name in faded gold lettering against a pane of frosted glass that had seen better decades. It was a humble threshold, yet it was the only place where I felt the oppressive weight of my marriage begin to lift from my weary shoulders. I turned the brass knob, feeling the familiar resistance of the lock, and stepped into a world that smelled of truth rather than artifice. Here, the air was a thick, comforting mixture of aged leather, the sharp bite of bourbon, and the permanent blue haze of Lucky Strike cigarettes. It was an environment that did not demand a polished smile or a flawless performance, it only demanded that I endure the passing of the hours without losing my mind. Maya did not look up immediately when I entered, her focus entirely consumed by the rapid-fire staccato of her Remington typewriter. The sound was the only rhythm I truly recognized as music anymore, a mechanical, honest cadence that stood in stark contrast to the shrieking violins of my wife's frequent tantrums. She was a woman of sharp angles and deep shadows, her presence anchoring the room with a gravity that I found myself orbiting like a lost satellite. She wore a simple charcoal blouse, the fabric dark and utilitarian, which served to highlight the rich, mahogany depths of her skin. There were no floral prints here, no lace to catch the eye, just the pure, unadorned strength of a survivor. She was an ebony statue come to life, a masterpiece of quiet defiance in a world that insisted she remain invisible or subservient. While Evelyn was a creature of the surface, a brightly painted facade that cracked at the slightest frost, Maya was the foundation, buried deep and immovable. She did not need to scream to be heard, her power resided in the way she occupied space and the meticulous efficiency with which she managed the chaos of my life. I watched the muscles in her forearms move as she hammered the keys, a display of competence that made the social posturing of the 1950s feel like a pathetic masquerade. She was the only person who looked at me and saw the men, not the detective. I crossed the room and sank into my leather chair, which groaned in sympathetic recognition of my frame. The desk was cluttered with the debris of a dozen failing lives, manila folders bulging with evidence of infidelity, debt, and the 1,000 petty cruelties that people inflict upon one another. Maya reached the end of a line, the typewriter bell chiming with a crisp, metallic finality that echoed in the small space. She pulled the carriage back with a fluid motion and finally raised her eyes to meet mine. There was no pretense in that gaze, no fluttering of eyelashes or rehearsed submission, only a piercing, cynical intelligence that stripped away my defenses before I could even draw a breath. She knew. She did not need me to tell her about the broken bird on the breakfast table or the way Evelyn's voice had sounded like shattering glass the night before. She could see it in the way I carried my shoulders, in the dark circles beneath my eyes, and in the slight, persistent tremor in my right hand. Maya had spent the last 3 years cataloging my decline, filing away my failures alongside the evidence of the crimes we investigated together. She was the keeper of my ledgers, both financial and moral, and she never judged the deficit. Her understanding was a cold, bracing wind that cleared the smoke from my lungs and reminded me that I was still tethered to reality by a single, slender thread. Evelyn would spend the morning weeping over a wilted gardenia or a misunderstood remark from a neighbor, her hysterics a theatrical display of a soul that had no substance. Maya, however, spent her time finding witnesses who did not want to be found, picking the locks of safes that held the dark secrets of the city's elite, and keeping us 2 steps ahead of the law. She was the architect of our survival, the one who navigated the treacherous waters of a society that despised her for her color and me for my lack of moral backbone. Without her, the office would have been nothing more than a hollow shell, and I would have been just another drunkard drowning in a sea of his own making. I reached for the bottle of bourbon I kept in the bottom drawer, the glass cool against my palm as I poured 2 ounces into a smeary glass. The liquid was the color of a tarnished sunset, and it burned with a familiar, welcome heat that cauterized the raw edges of my nerves. I did not offer her a drink, for we had long ago established a silent protocol that did not require the clumsy tools of polite conversation. Maya watched me drink, her expression unreadable, though I could sense the faint hum of her disapproval vibrating through the air. She did not hate the alcohol, she hated the reason I needed it, and her silence was more eloquent than any lecture my wife had ever delivered. She stood up from her desk, her movements as sleek and predatory as a panther moving through the tall grass of a forgotten savanna. She walked toward the window and adjusted the Venetian blinds, slicing the harsh morning light into a series of thin, horizontal bars that fell across the floor like the shadows of a prison cell. The city outside was a blurred tapestry of motion and noise, but in here, we were caught in a pocket of suspended time. Maya turned back to me, leaning against the filing cabinet that held the records of our most dangerous cases. The light caught the curve of her cheekbone, turning her skin into polished bronze, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. We were an impossible pair, a white man in a rumpled suit and a black woman who held the keys to his kingdom, living in a decade that would have happily burned us both for such an arrangement. The air between us was thick with things unsaid, a heavy, sensory tension that was far more intimate than any touch could ever be. I could smell the faint, earthy aroma of her skin, a mixture of cocoa butter and the bitter smoke of her own cigarette, which she now lit with a silver lighter. The flame flickered for a second, illuminating the depth of her dark eyes, and I felt a sudden, sharp pang of longing that had nothing to do with the bourbon or the heat. Maya took a long drag of her Lucky Strike, the tip glowing a fierce, angry orange in the dimness of the office. She exhaled a plume of gray smoke that curled around her head like a crown of thorns, her gaze never leaving my face. "You look like hell, Arthur," she said, her voice a low, melodic rasp that felt like sandpaper on silk. It was a simple statement of fact, stripped of pity or malice, and it was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in weeks. I leaned back and closed my eyes, letting the sound of her voice and the smell of the tobacco wash over me, feeling the jagged pieces of my sanity begin to knit themselves back together in the dark. She walked closer, stopping just inches from my desk, and I could feel the radiant heat of her body pushing back the chill that Evelyn had left in my marrow. She did not reach out to touch me, for that would have broken the spell that kept us functioning in the daylight hours, but the proximity was enough. We were 2 ghosts haunting the same ruin, bound together by a shared understanding of the world's cruelty and our own complicity in it. Maya reached down and picked up a manila folder from the top of the pile, her fingers brushing against the wood of the desk with a soft, sliding sound. "We have work to do," she murmured, and the words were a lifeline thrown into a dark sea. I watched her go back to her desk, the rhythm of the typewriter beginning anew, a frantic and purposeful heartbeat that filled the void in my chest. Outside, the sirens began to wail, and the city moved toward its inevitable, violent noon, but inside these 4 walls, I was safe. I looked at the glass of bourbon, then at the silhouette of the woman who really ran my life, and realized that the canary was not the only thing being strangled by red thread. But here, in the shadows and the smoke, I could at least see the knots, and perhaps, with Maya's help, I could find a way to cut them before the sun went down again. The truth of our lives was not found in the bright, floral patterns of a Connecticut dining room, but in the grime beneath our fingernails and the bitter taste of a morning drink. It was found in the way Maya never looked away from the darkness, and the way she offered me a sanctuary that was built on secrets rather than lies. I picked up a pen, the cold metal feeling heavy and significant in my hand, and began to write the first report of the day. The world might have been crumbling around us, and my marriage might have been a slow-motion car wreck, but as long as the Remington kept clicking and the Lucky Strikes kept burning, I was still alive. The night descended upon the city like a spill of viscous fuel oil, thick and iridescent with the grime of 1,000 industrial chimneys. It seeped into every alleyway and pooled around the base of the street lamps, drowning the remnants of the day in a heavy, suffocating indigo. From my window, the skyline of Manhattan felt like a distant, jagged memory, a collection of cold stone monoliths that offered no comfort to the lost or the weary. I sat motionless in the darkness of my office, listening to the muffled roar of the late traffic below, which sounded like the breathing of some great, subterranean beast. The world was dissolving into shadows, and I was content to let it disappear. My mind was still ringing with the high-pitched frequency of Evelyn's rage, a sound that had echoed through our hollow house for 3 hours before I finally walked out. She had been a cyclone of silk and hysteria, her voice cracking as she shrieked about the wasted decades she had sacrificed at the altar of our sterile marriage. The heirloom china, a gift from her grandmother that she had cherished with a fetishistic intensity, had become her ammunition. I could still hear the sharp, crystalline sound of the soup tureen shattering against the fireplace, the white shards flying across the room like shrapnel from a domestic bomb. It was a violent, beautiful destruction of her own carefully curated prison. "Look at what you have done to me, Arthur," she had screamed, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing that stripped away the last of her porcelain charm. She had clawed at her own throat, leaving angry red welts across her pale skin, a physical manifestation of the suffocating boredom that was slowly killing us both. I had stood there in the center of the debris, watching her crumble into a heap of expensive fabric and bitter tears, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity left in me, only a cold, hollow emptiness that sought the dark sanctuary of my office. I had left her there amidst the ruins of her precious plates, driving away without a single word of apology or comfort. Now, the only light in the room came from the flickering neon of the neighboring hotel sign, which cast rhythmic pulses of electric blue and blood red across my desk. I poured the last of the bourbon into a glass that was smudged with my own fingerprints, watching the amber liquid catch the shifting colors like a trapped, dying star. The ice had long since melted, leaving the whiskey diluted and tepid, but I drank it anyway, welcoming the sharp, medicinal burn in the back of my throat. Every swallow was a small act of defiance against the prim and proper world I was supposed to represent. I was a man in a rumpled suit, hiding in a shadow, and for the first time in months, I didn't care about the consequences. The radio in the corner was a scarred wooden relic that groaned with static before settling into a low, mournful jazz frequency from a station across the river. A lone saxophone began to play a melody so raw and stripped of pretense that it felt as though it were reaching inside my ribcage and pulling out my very soul. It was a sound of deep, urban loneliness, a late-night confession played on brass and air that laid my failures out on the cold linoleum floor for inspection. The notes hung in the stagnant air, vibrating against the glass of the window and the hollow of my chest. It was a funeral march for a life that was still technically breathing, a song for those who had already decided to disappear. I watched the neon reflection in my glass, the word vacancy blinking in and out of existence in a cruel, rhythmic mockery of my own internal state. My life was a series of empty rooms and borrowed furniture, a facade of success that was held together by social conventions and the fear of what the neighbors might say. I thought about the white picket fence and the way the morning light always looked so clean in Connecticut, and I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. It was all a lie, a beautifully painted shroud draped over a rotting corpse. I was done pretending that the silence of my home was peace, when I knew in my heart that it was nothing more than the quiet of a well-maintained graveyard. I didn't hear her come in, for Maya moved with the silence of a shadow merging with the dark, but I felt the air in the room shift and grow dense with her presence. She didn't turn on the lights, understanding instinctively that the darkness was the only thing protecting me from the jagged edges of my own thoughts. I could hear the faint rustle of her coat as she moved toward me, a soft, sliding sound that was more comforting than any words could ever be. She didn't ask why I was here or why the bottle was nearly empty, she simply existed in the space beside me, a solid, unwavering force of nature. In the silence between us, the saxophone continued its slow, agonizing lament for the city and its broken men. Then, her hands landed on my shoulders, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis as a jolt of pure, electric energy surged through the thick wool of my suit jacket. Her touch was not tentative or hesitant, it was a grounding, heavy pressure that seemed to anchor my drifting spirit back to the physical realm. I felt the warmth of her palms radiating through the fabric, a heat so intense and vital that it made the bourbon in my veins feel like ice water. It was the first honest contact I had experienced in years, a gesture of profound recognition that bypassed the brain and spoke directly to the animal heart. I closed my eyes and let my head fall back, surrendering to the overwhelming power of her proximity. In that singular moment, the entire weight of the world outside, the segregated lunch counters, the restrictive covenants, the laws of Jim Crow, simply ceased to matter. The social barriers that had been meticulously constructed to keep us on opposite sides of a great divide crumbled into ash and were swept away by the wind. The public scorn, the potential for professional ruin, and the threat of violence that hung over a man like me and a woman like her were all drowned out by the thudding of my own heart. We were no longer a detective and his secretary, we were two souls colliding in the void, desperate for the friction of another human being to prove that we were still made of something more than smoke. I could smell her now, a complex and intoxicating sensory map that replaced the stale odors of the office with something wild and primordial. It was the scent of dark cocoa mixed with the bitter, sharp tang of hand-rolled tobacco, a fragrance that felt like a journey into a hidden, subterranean world. There was a faint hint of rain-drenched earth and something muskier, something that spoke of heat and skin and the quiet desperation of the long nights we had spent working side by side. It was a smell that promised both salvation and damnation, a scent that I wanted to drown in until the memory of my wife's expensive French perfume was scrubbed entirely from my mind and my soul. I turned in the chair, the wood groaning under the shift of my weight, and looked up at her through the shifting pulses of the blue and red neon light. Her face was half submerged in shadow, her eyes glittering like dark gemstones that had been polished by a lifetime of hard truths and hidden pains. There was no pity in her expression, only a vast, terrifying understanding that mirrored my own internal devastation. She didn't move away, her hands sliding from my shoulders down to my chest, her fingers lingering on the buttons of my shirt as if she were counting the beats of my heart. The tension between us was a physical thing now, a taut, vibrating wire that was stretched to the point of snapping. I reached out and gripped her waist, pulling her toward me until the distance between us was nothing more than a few molecules of heated air. The contact was a shock to the system, the soft curve of her body pressing against the hard, unyielding lines of my own, a fusion of opposites that felt more natural than anything I had ever known. I could feel the rapid pulse in her throat beneath my thumb, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that matched the tempo of the jazz on the radio. At that moment, I realized that I had been a deserter for a long time, but only now was I finally crossing the border into the territory where I actually belonged. I was leaving the sterile world behind. This was not merely an act of passion, it was a violent rebellion against every lie I had been forced to tell since the day I was born. It was a rejection of the pristine suburbs, the country club memberships, and the suffocating morality of a society that valued appearances over the actual pulse of life. Every touch, every intake of breath in the heavy semi-darkness of the office was a deliberate betrayal of the man I was supposed to be. I was discarding the mask, piece by agonizing piece, and finding that underneath the layers of white privilege and social standing, there was a raw, aching need for something that was forbidden, something that was dangerous, and something that was absolutely real. We didn't need words to describe the gravity of what was happening. The air was thick with the weight of our shared history and the inevitable trajectory of our desire. I buried my face in the crook of her neck, tasting the salt and the heat of her skin, feeling the rough texture of her hair against my cheek. She let out a low, shuddering breath that sounded like a prayer or a curse, her hands tangling in my hair as she pulled me closer still. The world outside the frosted glass door, the city, the laws, the expectations, became a distant, irrelevant noise. In the sanctuary of the shadows, we were making our own laws, written in the language of skin and breath and the desperate hunger of the unwanted. I knew as I felt the warmth of her against me that there was no way to return to the man I had been when the sun rose that morning. The bridge was not just burning, it had been detonated, and the debris was falling into a dark, bottomless abyss from which nothing could ever be recovered. I had touched the thing that was most strictly under taboo, and instead of being destroyed by it, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of clarity. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of relief. I had finally stopped running from the truth of my own heart, and the truth was dark, beautiful, and carried the scent of cocoa and tobacco. Maya was the foundation I had been searching for beneath the shifting sands of my life, the only solid thing in a world made of cardboard cutouts and painted smiles. As we moved together in the dim light of the office, the saxophone on the radio reached a final, soaring crescendo before fading into the crackle of the airwaves. The neon sign outside flickered one last time and then went dark, leaving us in a perfect, velvety void where only our breathing remained. I had found my meaning in the ruins of my reputation, in the shadows of a city that would hate me for it, and in the arms of the only woman who had ever truly seen the men behind the badge and the bottle. Tomorrow would bring the threat of exposure, the inevitable whispers, and the cold, calculating eyes of a world that demanded conformity at any cost. I would have to face the wreckage of my home, the fury of my wife, and the judgment of a society that considered our connection a crime against nature. But as I held Maya in the quiet of the night, those fears seemed like flimsy, distant ghosts that had no power to harm me here. We were the masters of this small, smoke-filled kingdom, and for the first time in my 30 years, I was not afraid of the dark. The sun would rise soon enough, but the shadows we had created would remain with me, a permanent part of my new, illicit soul. I realized then that the porcelain life I had led was the true nightmare, and this hidden, dangerous existence was the only wakefulness I could endure. The scent of her was etched into my senses, a permanent reminder of the choice I had made in the heat of a jazz-soaked night. I had traded my comfort for a visceral truth, my reputation for a genuine touch, and my soul for the chance to feel something that wasn't a rehearsed emotion. Maya was my anchor in my storm, and in the wreckage of the office, amidst the smell of bourbon and the hum of the city, I had finally found the only home I would ever truly need. There was no going back, and I welcomed the fire. The afternoon in Connecticut unfolded with a deceptive, sluggish peace, the long shadows of the oak trees creeping across the perfectly manicured lawn like slow-moving ink stains. Inside the living room, the grandfather clock ticked with a heavy, rhythmic indifference, marking the passage of seconds that felt like hours in the stagnant, air-conditioned cool. Evelyn was sitting by the window, her needlework draped across her lap like a forgotten shroud, while the soft clinking of her silver spoon against the china teacup was the only sound that broke the oppressive silence. It was a picture of suburban bliss, yet the air felt thin and depleted, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for the floorboards to scream under the weight of our shared, unspoken misery. Evelyn had begun to inhabit a world made of whispers and imagined conspiracies, her descent into madness manifesting as a frantic need to reclaim the control she felt slipping through her fingers. She spent her afternoons huddled in the library with the curtains drawn, nursing a glass of sherry that never seemed to empty while she dialed numbers with a trembling, manic intensity. Her eyes, once as clear as a summer sky, had become clouded with a milky, frantic suspicion that darted from the shadows to the floorboards as if searching for a physical leak in her reality. She was convinced that I was slipping away, but she could not fathom the direction of my departure, so she turned to the only weapon a woman of her station truly understood. She started hiring private investigators, men with weary eyes and cheap suits who lurked in the bushes beyond our driveway or followed my car with the clumsy persistence of amateur hunters. It was a pathetic display of desperation that would have been comical if it weren't so deeply unsettling to witness the woman I once loved succumb to such base paranoia. She didn't know that she was playing a game on a board where all the pieces had already been claimed by someone far more competent than her. Every agency she contacted was a name already crossed through in my own ledgers, and every man she paid to watch me was a man whose salary was essentially being vetted by the very person they were meant to expose. Maya controlled the flow of information with the cold, surgical precision of a master puppeteer, ensuring that every report reaching Evelyn's desk was a masterpiece of benign fiction. While my wife pored over typed pages detailing my supposed lunches with bank managers and late nights spent reviewing dusty cold cases, the reality was pulsating in a different frequency. Maya sat at her desk in the city, her fingers dancing across the keys as she rewrote the narrative of our lives, protecting us with a shield made of fabricated alibis and carefully timed distractions. It was a psychological war conducted in the white spaces between the lines of text, a conflict where the casualties were the remnants of my wife's sanity. The nights in the suburbs were the worst, filled with the sudden, jagged sounds of Evelyn's screams echoing through the upstairs hallway like the cries of a bird caught in a chimney. She would burst into my bedroom at 3 o'clock in the morning, her hair disheveled and her face a mask of sweating, pale agony, demanding to know the name of the woman who was stealing her youth. Her accusations were wild and incoherent, swinging from the waitresses at the diner to the wives of my colleagues, never once landing on the truth that sat right in front of her every single day. I would lie there in the dark, watching the moonlight hit the ceiling, and wonder how much longer this grotesque parody of a marriage could possibly endure. Her demands became increasingly absurd, a series of frantic tests designed to anchor me to a home that had already become a mausoleum of our shared failures. She insisted on a complete renovation of the guest bathroom in the middle of the week, or demanded that we host elaborate dinner parties for people she openly loathed just to prove we were still a functional couple. I performed the role with a numb, robotic efficiency, nodding at the right moments and offering the expected pleasantries while my soul was miles away, anchored in the smoke-filled office. The more she tried to tighten her grip, the more she felt the ghost of our union crumbling into fine, gray ash that blew away with every intake of her breath. Every morning, the departure from that house felt like a miraculous escape from a sinking ship, a desperate crawl toward the dry land of the city where the air was honest and the lies were mine to control. I would drive toward the skyline with a frantic energy, the tires humming against the pavement as I shed the skin of the suburban husband and became the men who lived in the shadows. The transition was always jarring, a sensory whiplash that took me from the smell of fresh-cut grass and despair to the odor of gasoline and possibility. I was a man living two lives, each one a mirror of the other's flaws, and the pressure of the divide was beginning to create hairline fractures in the center of my skull. When I finally reached the office, the sight of Maya was the only medicine that could soothe the raw nerves and the persistent, throbbing headache that had become my constant companion. She never asked about the domestic horrors I had left behind, but I could see the awareness in the way she handed me my morning coffee, her dark eyes scanning my face for new signs of damage. There was an unspoken pact between us, a shared understanding that we were building our future on the foundation of a crumbling empire, and that every moment of peace we found was stolen from the jaws of a predator. Her presence was a sanctuary, a place where the rules of the 1955 social order were suspended. Our secret trysts took place in the sagging, neon-lit motels on the industrial outskirts of town, places where the wallpaper peeled in long, jaundiced strips and the air smelled of bleach and old regrets. We would meet in room number 12 or room number 7, spaces that belonged to no one and were inhabited only by the transient ghosts of other desperate people. The roar of the nearby highway was a constant, low-frequency vibration that rattled the window panes, drowning out the sound of our voices and the frantic beating of our hearts. In those rooms, stripped of the trappings of our social roles, we found a purity that was entirely absent from the sanctified, sterile halls of my church-blessed house. The bed would groan under our weight, a rhythmic, metallic protest that blended with the shifting gears of the trucks passing just outside the thin, water-stained walls. In the dim, flickering light of a broken bedside lamp, the contrast of our skin was a visual symphony that made the rest of the world feel flat and colorless. I would trace the lines of her shoulders with a reverence I had never felt for anything else, feeling the heat of her blood through the surface of her skin, a reminder that we were still alive in a world that wanted us dead. We were two fugitives hiding in plain sight, carving out a kingdom of 500 square feet where the laws of men and the judgment of God held no dominion. This secret life was a dangerous, intoxicating drug that sharpened my senses and made the mundane reality of my job feel like a high-stakes gamble with no limit. The risk was a living thing that breathed down our necks, a constant shadow that stood in the corner of every motel room and sat in the passenger seat of every car ride we took together. In 1955, a man like me being seen with a woman like her in such a manner was a death sentence for a career and a literal threat to her physical safety. Yet, instead of making me pull away, the danger only served to fuel our mutual obsession, turning our desire into a desperate, white-hot fire that consumed everything in its path. We became masters of the subtle glance and the coded message, our communication a complex architecture of gestures and silences that allowed us to function in public without ever revealing the depth of our connection. I would watch her across the office as she moved from the filing cabinet to the window, her grace a sharp, painful contrast to the clumsy, flailing movements of my wife. I knew the exact curve of her spine and the way her pulse quickened when I stood too close, yet to the outside world, she was merely the efficient black woman who kept the detective's books in order. It was a role she played with a cynical brilliance that made me admire her as much as I desired her. The psychological strain was a slow-acting poison, seeped into my marrow and turning my thoughts into a jagged landscape of paranoia and longing. I found myself checking the rearview mirror at every intersection, looking for the phantom shapes of Evelyn's detectives, even though I knew Maya had them on a short, invisible leash. The double life demanded a constant, exhausting vigilance that made the hours of sleep I managed to steal feel like a temporary unconsciousness rather than true rest. I was a man stretched between two worlds, one a brightly lit stage of lies and the other a dark, velvet-lined basement of truth, and I was terrified of the moment they would finally collide. The contrast between the motel's grit and the house's sterility created a distorted sense of morality in my mind, where the sinful acts felt like the only virtuous things I had ever done. I found more holiness in the way Maya's hand felt in mine beneath a stained motel sheet than I had ever felt in 10 years of kneeling in a cushioned pew next to Evelyn. The dirt of the outskirts was honest. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was, unlike the pristine white paint of the suburbs which only served to hide the rot beneath the surface. We were finding our salvation in the places society deemed irredeemable, and the irony of our situation was a bitter, satisfying taste. Back in Connecticut, the atmosphere was growing more claustrophobic by the hour, the house seemingly shrinking as Evelyn's mania expanded to fill every available cubic inch of space. She had begun to talk to the furniture, whispering her grievances to the velvet armchairs and the crystal chandeliers as if they were the only witnesses she could still trust. Her laughter was the most frightening sound I had ever heard, a high, brittle peal that shattered the evening silence and left a ringing in my ears that lasted for hours afterward. She was a woman drowning on dry land, her lungs filling with the imaginary water of her own making, and I was simply waiting for the final, inevitable plunge. I would stand in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her sleep, if the fitful, twitching state she occupied could even be called sleep, and feel a cold, detached sense of wonder at how far we had fallen. She was a ghost of the girl I had married, a hollow shell animated by nothing but suspicion and the desperate need to be seen as the center of someone's universe. The floral wallpaper of the room seemed to vibrate with her agitation, the tiny printed roses looking like mocking, red eyes that followed my every movement with a silent, judgmental intensity. I was a stranger in my own home, a man who had already packed his bags in his mind and was merely waiting for the train to arrive. The danger was a physical weight now, a pressure in my chest that made every breath feel like a victory over an invisible enemy. Maya and I were moving toward a climax that neither of us could fully visualize, but we could both feel it in the way the air crackled between us during the long, silent drives back into the heart of the city. We were tied together by more than just passion, we were bound by the shared knowledge that our survival depended on our ability to maintain the illusion until the very last second. The fire was growing, fueled by the wreckage of my marriage and the oppressive weight of the 1955 social order, and soon, it would burn through the floorboards. One evening, as I was preparing to leave the house, I found a small, leather-bound notebook of Evelyn's lying open on the hall table, its pages covered in a frantic, illegible scrawl. Among the rambling complaints and the lists of groceries, I saw my own name written over and over again in dark, heavy ink that had bled through to the other side of the paper. Next to it was the word secret followed by a series of jagged, violent marks that looked like claws scratching at a cage. A sudden, cold chill settled in the small of my back as I realized that she was closer to the edge than I had ever imagined. The hunt was no longer a game, it had become a pursuit of blood in my own home. I closed the notebook with a trembling hand, the sound of the leather clicking shut echoing through the silent, oppressive hallway like a gunshot in a library. I could hear Evelyn humming a tuneless, haunting melody from the top of the stairs, a sound that made the hair on my arm stand up in a primal, instinctive reaction to a nearby threat. I didn't look up, I just grabbed my hat and my keys, walking out into the humid evening air with the frantic pace of a man fleeing a burning building. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody streaks across the manicured lawns of the neighborhood, and I knew that the night ahead would be the most dangerous one yet. I needed the city, and I needed Maya. The rain hammered against the frosted glass of the office door with a savage, unrelenting persistence, sounding like thousands of tiny, desperate fingernails scratching to get inside. It was a cold, gray downpour that had turned the city into a blurred watercolor of charcoal and slate, drowning the neon signs in a watery grave. Inside, the air was stagnant and thick with the smell of wet wool and the sharp, metallic tang of the radiator that hissed like a cornered viper in the shadows. I sat at my desk, the weight of the day pressing down on my eyelids, feeling the rhythmic, heavy vibrations of the thunder echoing in the very marrow of my aching bones. Maya was standing by the mahogany filing cabinet, her silhouette a sharp, dark cutout against the flickering street lamps that struggled to penetrate the gloom of the office. She didn't speak, but the way she moved, a slow, deliberate grace that seemed to ignore the chaotic weather outside, was the only thing keeping me anchored to the floorboards. I watched the smoke from her cigarette curl toward the water-stained ceiling, a lazy gray ribbon that danced in the dim, amber light of the desk lamp. We were waiting for something inevitable, though neither of us could have named the monster that was currently climbing the wooden stairs toward our hidden sanctuary. The sound of the office door crashing open was like a physical blow to the chest, a violent eruption that shattered the delicate silence of the room and sent the stacks of paper on my desk flying like panicked white birds. There stood Evelyn, framed by the dark, wet hallway, her expensive silk trench coat clinging to her frame like a second, sodden skin that shimmered with the cold moisture of the night. Her blonde hair, usually a masterpiece of rigid control, was now a tangled, weeping mess that fell over her face in jagged, golden streaks. She looked less like a woman and more like a vengeful spirit conjured from the depths of a suburban nightmare. Her makeup was a total ruin, the black mascara running down her pale cheeks in dark, ink-like rivers that pooled in the hollows of her eyes, making her look like a tragic clown in some forgotten film. Her lipstick was smeared across her chin, a bright, visceral red that looked like a fresh wound against the ghostly pallor of her skin. In her right hand, she gripped the heavy silver revolver with a white-knuckled intensity, the barrel trembling but unmistakably leveled at the space where Maya stood. Evelyn's eyes burned with a cold, deathly luster, a frozen fire that consumed everything it touched with the absolute, terrifying certainty of a dying star. "I found you," she hissed, the words dripping with a venom that had been brewing in the dark corners of our home for more years than I cared to count. It was the sound of every shattered plate, every lonely night, and every whispered suspicion finally coalescing into a single, lethal intent. She wasn't just looking at Maya, she was looking at the embodiment of everything that had stolen her husband, her pride, and her sanity. Her hatred was a physical force, an invisible heat that made the cold rain dripping from her coat sizzle against the floorboards. She had reached the absolute edge of her world, and she was ready to pull the trigger to end it all. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal, and stepped into the direct line of fire, placing my body between the gun and the woman I loved. The air between me and the muzzle of the revolver felt electrified, a high-tension wire that hummed with the promise of a violent, final release. I could see the tiny imperfections in the silver finish of the weapon, the dark, empty circle of the barrel that seemed to grow until it swallowed the entire room. My hands were open, a useless gesture of peace in a situation that had moved far beyond the reach of words or reason. I was a man waiting for the end of his own complicated story. Something inside me finally snapped, a silent, internal collapse that felt like the foundation of a building giving way to the sea. All the months of lying, all the years of pretending to be the man Evelyn wanted, and all the suffocating weight of the suburban facade crumbled into a fine, gray dust. I didn't feel fear in that moment, only a profound, crystalline clarity that made every detail of the room stand out in terrifyingly sharp relief. I looked at my wife and saw not a partner, but a stranger who had been holding me hostage in a life I never truly wanted. The gun was just the final, honest punctuation mark at the end of a very long, very exhausting sentence. I glanced back at Maya, expecting to see the frantic terror of a woman staring death in the face, but what I found was something entirely different and infinitely more disturbing. She was standing perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed on Evelyn with a calm that was almost supernatural, an ecstatic tranquility that seemed to transcend the physical danger. There was no tremor in her hands, no sweat on her brow. She was an island of absolute stillness in the center of the hurricane. It was as if she had already accepted this moment long ago, as if she were a witness to an inevitable ritual that was finally reaching its preordained, messy, and predictably bloody conclusion. Maya began to move, her steps silent and deliberate as she walked toward me, ignoring the silver death that Evelyn was aiming at her chest with a shaking, manic hand. She reached out and placed her palm against my forearm, her skin burning with a vital, pulsing heat that felt like a bolt of lightning passing through the fabric of my suit jacket. This simple touch was a revelation, a silent declaration of ownership and solidarity that stripped away the last of our defenses. In that singular contact, she was telling me that we were already beyond the reach of whatever damage Evelyn could inflict. We were together, and in that togetherness, we were finally, terrifyingly free. The atmosphere in the office became impossibly dense, filled with the primal scent of the rain, the ozone of the coming storm, and the faint, bitter aroma of gunpowder that seemed to hang in the air even before the shot was fired. It was a moment of absolute, raw vulnerability, a nudity of our souls that was far more intimate than any physical act we had ever shared in the shadows. The social order, the laws of the land, and the expectations of our race and station were all incinerated in the heat of this confrontation. We were standing on the precipice of a catastrophe, and for the first time in our lives, we were looking at it with eyes wide open and hearts laid bare. Evelyn watched the touch, her breath hitching in a jagged, pathetic sob that sounded like the dying gasp of a broken music box. Her grip on the revolver faltered for a second, the silver barrel dipping as she struggled to reconcile the scene before her with the world she had fought so hard to maintain. She was losing her audience, her power, and her purpose, all at the same time, and the realization was a physical weight that was crushing the air from her lungs. The hatred was still there, but it was being rapidly overtaken by a profound, hollow exhaustion that made her movements look slow and heavy, like someone trying to run through the depths of waist-deep water. I made a single, slow step forward, my eyes locked on the trigger finger that was beginning to curl with a desperate, final tension. The silence in the room was so profound that I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall and the sound of the rain turning into a dull, distant roar. Then, a sharp, metallic click echoed through the office, the sound of the hammer being cocked, a noise that sounded like a thunderclap in the confined space. It was the point of no return, the bridge between the world of the living and the world of the shadows. I waited for the flash, for the heat, and for the sudden, dark silence that would surely follow the impact. But the bullet never came. The sound of the hammer was followed only by a long, shuddering silence that felt like the world had forgotten how to turn on its axis. Evelyn's hand began to shake so violently that the revolver slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the soles of my shoes. She stared at the weapon as if it were a poisonous snake that had suddenly appeared at her feet, her mouth working but no words coming out. The fire in her eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a vacant, glassy stare that saw nothing but the cold wreckage of her own reflection in the puddles on the floor. She didn't scream, and she didn't cry, she simply folded in on herself, her knees giving way as she collapsed onto the floor amidst the scattered papers and the dust. She looked small and frail, a broken doll cast aside by a child who had finally grown tired of the game. All the years of hysterical demands, the manic suspicions, and the desperate attempts at control had led her to this moment of absolute, crushing impotence. She was a woman who had tried to kill the truth with a piece of silver and lead, only to find that the truth was immune to such mundane violence. She lay there in a heap of sodden silk, a ruin in her own temple of lies, defeated by her own lack of spirit. Maya didn't move to help her, and neither did I. We simply stood there, illuminated by the cold blue light of the neon sign outside, watching the fallen woman breathe. The office felt different now, as if the air had been scrubbed clean by the intensity of the storm and the weight of the confrontation. The smell of the rain was stronger, and the distant sounds of the city began to filter back into the room, a reminder that the world was still moving on without us. We were two survivors standing on the shores of a new and uncertain existence, our souls still vibrating from the proximity of the end. The facade was gone, and in its place was a terrifying, beautiful emptiness. The clock on the wall struck the hour of 9, its deep, resonant chimes echoing through the room with a sense of finality that seemed to seal our fate. The storm outside was beginning to break, the heavy clouds parting to reveal a sliver of a pale, indifferent moon that cast long, distorted shadows across the office floor. We stood together in the half-light, two people who had looked into the abyss and seen only themselves reflected back. The silence was absolute, a heavy, velvet curtain that had fallen on the last act of a very long and painful play. The night was ours, and for the first time in 30 years, the truth was the only thing left to tell in this darkened city. 6 months had bled into the soil of Connecticut since that rain-drenched night in the city, and the suburban landscape had reclaimed its deceptive, emerald peace. From the outside, the house on the corner looked exactly as it always had, a pristine monument to mid-century stability with its white shutters and perfectly edged stone walkways. The neighborhood remained a stage for the quiet performances of the affluent, where the only scandals discussed were the height of a neighbor's hedge or the quality of a summer cocktail. Yet, the air inside the fence had changed, vibrating with a different frequency that none of the locals dared to acknowledge openly in the light of day. I sat on the wooden terrace in the late afternoon heat, the very spot where I had once discovered the mangled, silk-bound body of the yellow canary. The memory of that broken bird was now nothing more than a faint, bitter shadow, a ghost that had been exorcised by the much larger ghosts we had invited into our home. I leaned back in the wicker chair, the same one Evelyn used to occupy during her long afternoons of silent judgment, and watched the smoke from my cigarette drift toward the oak trees. The sun was a bloated, orange orb sinking behind the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows that stretched across the lawn like the fingers of a weary giant. The silence of the house was no longer a suffocating shroud, but a deliberate choice, a fortress of quiet that we had built around ourselves to keep the prying eyes of the world at bay. Evelyn was gone, relocated to a private sanatorium nestled high in the Adirondack Mountains, where the air was thin and the walls were painted a sterile, calming shade of bone white. There, the doctors treated her chronic melancholy with a steady diet of heavy sedatives and the rhythmic, electric jolts of shock therapy that promised to scour her mind of its jagged, inconvenient memories. She was safe, she was cared for, and most importantly, she was no longer a threat to the architecture of our new life. The monthly bills for her confinement were substantial, but they were paid with a punctuality that bordered on the obsessive, drawn from a complex web of insurance policies and hidden accounts. Maya had seen to that with her characteristic, cold brilliance, having meticulously rearranged our financial landscape a full month before the revolver ever touched the office floorboards. It was a masterpiece of paper and ink, a series of signatures that ensured Evelyn would never lack for the highest quality of professional isolation that money could buy. Every form was a brick in her new prison, every stamp a seal on the tomb of her former existence, and we slept soundly knowing the fortress was secure. I could still hear the distant, imagined echo of Evelyn's screams in the mountain air, but they were drowned out by the comforting, real-world sounds of the house being occupied by a woman who truly belonged there. Now, the scent of the rooms was a heady mixture of dark cocoa, expensive tobacco, and the faint, earthy musk of a body that did not apologize for its presence. The smell of lemon wax and funeral lilies had been scrubbed away, replaced by the visceral, living aroma of a sanctuary that was no longer a museum for a dead marriage. I took a long drag of my cigarette, feeling the heat of the smoke in my lungs, and realized that I had never felt more at home. Maya appeared in the doorway of the terrace, her silhouette a sharp, commanding dark shape against the golden light of the hallway. She did not wear the floral cotton dresses or the starched aprons that had been the uniform of my previous life. She wore silk robes and sharp, tailored trousers that emphasized the strength of her frame. She moved through the house with the unhurried grace of a conqueror, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors with a rhythm that was both a melody and a claim of ownership. She was the mistress of this white-painted cage, and she performed the role with a cynical, magnificent ease that made the neighbors' blood run cold. She did not spend her mornings baking apple pies or fussing over the arrangement of the gardenias in the silver bowls on the sideboard. Instead, she spent them reviewing our ledgers and making the phone calls that kept our world spinning, her voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. When she walked past the windows, she did not hide behind the heavy curtains, she stood in the light, her dark skin a defiant contrast to the pale, suburban landscape that surrounded us. She was a living act of subversion, a shadow that had moved into the light and refused to flicker, and I watched her with a devotion that bordered on the fanatical. We used Evelyn's silver every night, the heavy, ornate spoons and forks that bore her family crest feeling solid and cool against our palms. There was a dark, intoxicating pleasure in the way we sat at her mahogany table, drinking her vintage wine and eating the food that she had once dictated with such neurotic precision. We were not merely living in her house, we were consuming her life, piece by agonizing piece, and find the taste of the theft more delicious than anything we had ever earned. The injustice of it was a seasoning that made every meal a victory, a reminder that the world belonged not to the virtuous, but to those who were willing to take it. The neighbors were our audience, a collection of terrified, twitching curtains and hushed conversations that died away whenever we stepped onto the sidewalk. They saw a white man and a black woman living in open, unapologetic defiance of every law and custom of 1956, and their fear was a tangible thing that hung in the air like smog. They did not call the police, for they knew that Maya had the files to ruin every one of them, but they retreated into their own homes as if we were a plague that had settled in their midst. We were the monsters in their garden, the dark spot on their pristine, white sun, and their collective hatred was the highest form of flattery we could receive. Every night, we slept in the massive, four-poster bed that had been the center of my long, sterile union with a woman who was now a ghost in the mountains. The silk sheets were cool and smooth, the same ones Evelyn had picked out during a shopping trip to New York City that had cost more than my first car. In the darkness, the intimacy we shared was a desperate, fierce collision that had nothing to do with the polite, whispered couplings of my past. We were two souls who had crossed a moral abyss to reach one another, and in the sanctuary of that stolen bed, the weight of our betrayer's fate was the only thing that made us feel truly, viscerally alive. There was no remorse in the way I looked at Maya, and there was no pity in the way she looked at me. We had traded our humanity for a chance at a freedom that the world had never intended for us to have. We were built on a foundation of ruins, our happiness constructed from the wreckage of a woman's mind and the destruction of a social order that had tried to keep us apart. If the price of our union was the slow, agonizing decline of a light-haired socialite in a mountain retreat, then it was a price we were both more than willing to pay. We had won our war, not through grand gestures of heroism, but through the patient, calculated application of cruelty and truth. I watched the last sliver of the sun disappear, the sky turning a deep, bruised violet that reminded me of the ink on the insurance forms Maya had so carefully prepared. The crickets began their rhythmic, mechanical chirping in the tall grass, a sound that felt like the ticking of a clock that would never run down. I knew that some might look at our life and see a tragedy, a horrific perversion of justice where the villains had escaped with the treasure and the crown. But as Maya walked onto the terrace and placed her hand on my shoulder, her fingers warm and steady, I knew that justice was merely a story told by those who were too afraid to do what was necessary. The house was our fortress, a captured castle where we made our own laws and worshipped our own dark gods in the quiet hours of the night. We were the masters of this small, Connecticut kingdom, and the screams of the past were nothing more than the wind rattling the windowpanes of our sanctuary. I stood up and turned to the woman who had saved me from the porcelain madness of my previous existence, pulling her close until I could smell the bitter tobacco on her breath. We had left morality to rot at the threshold, and in the emptiness of its absence, we had found a peace that was as sharp and as beautiful as a razor blade against the skin. The night was complete now, the stars beginning to puncture the velvet darkness with a cold, indifferent light that cared nothing for the lives of the people below. We walked back inside, the heavy oak door clicking shut with a finality that signaled the end of the day and the beginning of our real, hidden life. Behind us, the town of 1956 continued to sleep, dreaming of its white picket fences and its flawless, floral domesticity, while we remained awake in the shadows of their nightmares. We were the victors of a silent revolution, and as the lights in the house went out one by one, the only thing that remained was the heat of our shared, magnificent, and entirely unjust reality.